Daniel Harper rose, just before dawn. The morning air was cool, clinging to the ground like a low mist. His small cabin stood silent behind him, worn from years of wind and dust. He didn't linger. He threw the saddle over Grace's back, tightened the worn straps, and secured the few supplies he had gathered: a small bag of oats, a hunting knife, 2 canteens, and an old revolver tucked into his belt. Grace, a gray mare well past her prime, shifted under the saddle but didn't protest. They both knew the road ahead would be long. Daniel mounted with a grunt, settling into the familiar creak of leather, and steered her down the dirt track leading away from everything he had ever known. The landscape stretched endlessly, dry grass rolling in slow waves under the morning light. Fences, long abandoned, leaned into the earth at odd angles. The sky was a pale blue, already promising heat before noon. Daniel kept Grace at a steady walk. There was no rush. Rushing got a man killed out here. By late morning, the sun hung high and heavy. Sweat beaded under Daniel's hat, and he loosened the kerchief around his neck. They crossed a dried-up riverbed, its cracked floor littered with bleached stones and brittle twigs. Grace stumbled once, but regained her footing. Daniel spoke to her in low murmurs, not to soothe her, but to keep himself company. Words felt thin out here, but silence was worse. In the distance, a thin smudge of buildings broke the horizon. A town, or what was left of one. As they rode closer, Daniel saw a collapsed barn, a church missing half its roof, and a row of buildings beaten down by sun and time. No smoke, no movement. He hesitated at the town's edge. Empty towns could mean anything: disease, raiders, drought. He guided Grace slowly down the main street, past the hollowed-out shells of what once had been homes. A rusted wagon wheel leaned against a crumbling wall. Tattered curtains fluttered in the broken windows. Daniel dismounted in front of what might have been a general store. He led Grace by the reins, stepping carefully over shattered glass and rotting wood. Inside, the shelves were bare, save for a few rusted cans and broken bottles. He found an old tin cup, kicked aside by some desperate hand long ago, but nothing worth taking. Outside, a well stood near the center of the town. Daniel tried the pump. It groaned, coughed up a splash of brackish water, then nothing. He filled 1 canteen anyway, straining the water through a scrap of cloth. Grace pawed at the ground, restless. Daniel knew better than to stay. Towns like this had a way of drawing bad things. They moved on. Afternoon fell heavy across the plains. Dust swirled in lazy spirals, kicked up by an endless wind. Daniel rode in silence, the only sounds the creak of leather and the soft clop of Grace's hooves. The land around them changed little, endless, dry, and different. As the sun began to dip, painting the sky with streaks of orange and gold, Daniel searched for a place to camp. They found a shallow hollow, shielded on 3 sides by scrub and low rocks. It wasn't much, but it would do. He unsaddled Grace, checked her hooves, and rubbed her down with a piece of old cloth. She stood patiently, her ribs visible under her dusty coat. Daniel gave her the last of the oats he had rationed for the day, then set about making a fire. The wood was scarce and dry. His fire was small, a flicker against the vastness of the night. He sat close, eating a piece of hard bread and dried meat. Overhead, the stars began to punch through the fading light, sharp and cold. The night was quiet except for the occasional skitter of some unseen animal. Daniel sat with his back against a rock, revolver laid across his lap. Sleep came slowly, in short, shallow bursts. Out here, a man slept with one ear open. Before he closed his eyes, he glanced at Grace, who had already laid down nearby, breathing steady and slow. Tomorrow, they would ride farther west, toward a town he had heard about from a passing trader, a place where the soil was still good, where a man might find a reason to stay. or at least a place to rest without watching his back every second. He didn't allow himself to hope much. Hope was a dangerous thing on the trail, but for tonight it was enough just to breathe, to sit by a fire, and to know he was still moving forward. And that, maybe, was all a man could ask for. Morning came pale and slow. The fire had long since burned itself out, leaving only a circle of cold ash. Daniel stirred from his uneasy sleep, joints stiff from the hard ground. Grace rose too, shaking dust from her coat. Daniel packed quickly. He strapped the saddle back onto Grace, cinched it tight, and secured his meager supplies. The bread and dried meat were nearly gone. He took a slow swallow from the brackish water he had pumped the day before. It tasted of iron and mud, but it was all he had. They set off west again, into a wind that never seemed to rest. The land stretched empty in every direction. No fences now, no towns, just low scrub and occasional stands of twisted trees. Somewhere far ahead was a river, if the trader had told the truth, a place where settlers had started planting new crops, building something from the dust. Daniel kept his eyes moving. Out here, danger didn't always announce itself. Bandits, wild animals, even another man desperate enough could end you for a scrap of bread. Grace plodded steadily beneath him, her hooves sending up little puffs of dust with every step. By midday, the sun was brutal overhead. Daniel pulled his hat lower and kept going, stopping only once to let Grace drink a few precious mouthfuls of water. He didn't drink himself. Water was running low, and he needed to keep Grace alive more than himself. Without her, the plains would swallow him before he ever reached the river. In the distance, a dark shape broke the sameness of the land. Daniel tensed, shifting his weight slightly in the saddle. As they rode closer, he saw it was an old wagon, half buried in dust, the canvas cover torn to rags. He dismounted cautiously, keeping one hand near his revolver. The wagon had been picked clean long ago. No supplies, no signs of who had owned it, just broken wheels and splintered boards. Daniel found a child's rag doll under the seat, bleached pale by sun and wind. He set it back down gently. There was no one here now. Whatever had happened a long time ago. He mounted up and moved on. The land grew rougher in the afternoon, the soil giving way to scattered rocks and shallow ravines. Twice Daniel had to dismount and lead Grace carefully down and up the broken ground. His legs ached from walking, but he said nothing, just pressed forward. By late afternoon, he saw what looked like a trail, not a real road, but the worn traces of wagon wheels and hoof prints cutting westward. Hope stirred in him, small and cautious. Trails meant people. People meant water, supplies, maybe even work if he could find it. He followed the trail as the sun sank lower, casting long shadows across the ground. The wind died down for the first time all day, and the silence that followed was thick and strange. Daniel listened hard, but heard nothing except the soft clink of Grace's bridle and the faint crunch of their steps. Just before twilight, they crested a low ridge. Below them, in a wide valley, Daniel saw a cluster of buildings, real ones, not the hollowed-out ghosts he'd passed before. Smoke rose from chimneys. A river snaked through the valley, shining silver in the dying light. Relief washed through him, so suddenly it left him dizzy. He patted Grace's neck, murmuring thanks he didn't quite believe in, and nudged her into a slow descent toward the town. As they drew closer, he could make out details: a blacksmith shop, a small church with a bell tower, a handful of houses scattered around a dusty main street. It wasn't much, but it was alive. People moved between the buildings, men in work shirts, women in faded dresses, a few children chasing each other through the dust. Daniel rode in slow, wary. Outsiders were not always welcome, especially men riding alone. He kept his hands visible, reins loose in one hand, the other resting lightly on the saddle horn. A few heads turned as he passed. Most people gave him a quick glance, then went back to their work. A couple of boys stared openly, wide-eyed at the stranger and his tired horse. Daniel found the hitching post outside what looked to be a saloon, though it was barely more than a ramshackle building with swinging doors and a faded sign overhead. He dismounted, wincing as his knees protested, and led Grace to the trough. Fresh water. Real water, clear and cold. Grace drank greedily, and Daniel led her, watching the street from under the brim of his hat. After a moment, he turned and pushed through the saloon doors. Inside, it was cooler, the air heavy with the smell of sweat, tobacco, and old wood. A few men sat at rough tables, nursing drinks. A barkeep wiped a glass behind the counter, eyeing Daniel without expression. Daniel walked up slowly, pulled a coin from his pocket, and set it on the bar. "Whiskey," he said simply. The barkeep poured without comment. Daniel took the glass, savoring the burn as it slid down his throat. It was the first good thing he'd tasted in days. The barkeep leaned in slightly. "Passing through?" he asked. Daniel considered the question. "Maybe." The man nodded, as if that answer was good enough. "You'll want to talk to Miller," the barkeep said, jerking his thumb toward a man sitting alone at the back. "Owns most of the land around here. If there's work to be had, he'd know." Daniel finished his drink in a single swallow and set the glass down. "Much obliged," he said. He crossed the saloon in slow, deliberate steps. The man at the table, Miller, apparently, looked up as Daniel approached. He was thick-set, with a graying beard and sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Name's Harper," Daniel said, tipping his hat slightly. "Looking for work." Miller looked him up and down, taking in the dust, the worn clothes, the hard lines of a man who'd been too long on the trail. "You any good with horses?" Miller asked. Daniel nodded once. "Good," Miller said. "Got a mare needs tending. Some others too, if you prove yourself. Pays not much. Food and a roof, mostly." Daniel didn't hesitate. "I'll take it," he said. Miller just grunted, as if he'd expected no other answer. "Be at my place at sunup," he said. "End of the street, past the church." Daniel nodded again, turned, and walked out into the cooling evening. Grace waited for him, patient as always. He rubbed her nose gently and smiled. "Looks like we got ourselves a place for now, girl," he murmured. The stars blinked to life overhead as he led her toward the edge of town. For the first time in a long while, Daniel Harper felt something close to peace. The day had begun before the sun had even set. The chill of the morning air was bone-chilling as the first rays slowly melted the shadows. Daniel, accustomed to the road, slept lightly and rose at once when the sounds around him began to come alive. He led Grace to the well behind the church, gave her something to drink, and washed himself with ice-cold water. Simple gestures restored his sense of order. A little later, he approached Miller's house, a large but dilapidated house, standing apart from the other buildings. The white paint had long since peeled off, and the windows were covered in a thin film of dust. Miller himself was sitting on the porch, a cup of black coffee in his hand. He did not say hello, only nodded, as if Daniel were not a person, but another part of the work. "The stables are over there," he said, jerking his chin toward the long barn behind the house. "A mare named Rose. Take better care of her than yourself." Daniel nodded briefly and headed for the barn. The stable smelled of old boards, hay, and animal sweat. Rose stood in the far corner, a dark bay, tall, with a heavy gaze. She watched his every move carefully. He immediately understood. The horse was smart, but with a character, perhaps with the same burden on her soul that he carried. He spoke to her quietly, not approaching right away, giving her time to get used to it. There was a warm firmness in his voice, no cooing, no rudeness, just confidence that everything would be done right. After a few minutes, Rose allowed him to approach. He gently ran his hand over her neck, feeling the tension under his fingers, the scars from old wounds. This was not just a workhorse. She had a history of fighting for survival. The work began on its own, brushing, checking hooves, cleaning the stall. Daniel's hands moved easily, almost mechanically, as if his body remembered what to do. There was something about the routine that brought him peace, if only for a moment. Around noon, Miller came to check on things. He stood leaning against the doorframe, silent and heavy as an old oak. "You seem to understand how to handle them," he said finally. Daniel didn't answer. He just stroked Rose's side again as she stood there, snorting softly. "I have 5 more like them. Different ones." Miller took off his hat and scratched his forehead. "But they'll take some work. It's not every day that someone like you finds his way here." The words sounded strange, almost like a hint, but Daniel didn't ask what he meant. He knew that in places like this, too many stories were left unsaid. Life settled into a measured rhythm in the days that followed, with the first rays of the sun, to the horses, to clean, feed, inspect, sometimes to go out with them to the pasture, to check the boundaries of the land. Miller paid little, but the food was warm, and you could spend the night in an old barn next to the stable. After months of wandering, it seemed almost a luxury. People in town looked at Daniel with caution, but without open hostility. He did not try to gain their trust, did not ask questions. He counted the days by the sun and the wind by the dust, felt how his shoulders were gaining strength again, and his legs remembered the long marches on the ground. He was especially drawn to Rose. Cautious at first, she allowed him more and more with each passing day. She let him get closer, trusted him with her weight when he raised his hooves, did not shy away from rough sounds. Daniel saw in her eyes the same gleam as in his own, unbroken fatigue. Sometimes he would sit on the railing of the corral, watching her walk in circles on the dusty ground, and think about the home he no longer had, about the people he had lost. One of those evenings, Miller came up to him. "Rose is a tough one," he said, stopping next to her. "She used to be the best in the team. Then something happened." He stopped mid-sentence. "They wanted to shoot her. They said it wasn't worth the trouble." Daniel was silent. Miller looked at him with a long, hard look. "You seem to understand people like that." It wasn't praise or gratitude. It was just a statement of fact. Daniel nodded. They stood in silence as the sun sank slowly below the horizon, leaving the sky in blood-orange streaks. That evening, for the first time, Daniel allowed himself to sleep peacefully, because sometimes life is not about coming home and finding something new, even if it is in a broken stable under a hopeless sky. A week passed, and Daniel knew every horse on the property. He knew which ones flinched at loud noises and which ones slept standing like sentinels. They were as different as the people he had met in his life, some stubborn, some broken, some simply tired. Rosa remained his anchor. Each morning, she would greet him with a soft rumble deep in her throat. It wasn't affection, not yet. It was trust, a fragile thing that needed to be handled carefully, like an old knife with a cracked handle. Daniel spent most of his days working the fields with the horses, repairing fences that bowed under the pressure of storms and time. The land was scarred, much like the creatures it held. Drought had cracked the soil in long, angry veins. Trees leaned crookedly, as if bowing to something only they could see. The people of the town had started to notice him now, not just as a passing drifter, but as someone who stayed. They watched from their porches, from behind windows, from the shade of old sycamores. Men would lift a hand in greeting. Women nodded once and moved along. It wasn't warmth. It was a reluctant kind of respect. Miller remained distant. He was a man of few words and fewer smiles. In the evenings, he would sit by the fire outside the house, a bottle in one hand, staring into the flames, like trying to read some secret future there. Daniel never asked about Miller's past, and Miller never asked about his. That was how men like them survived, by leaving ghosts where they lay. One afternoon, as Daniel was oiling Rosa's saddle, Miller approached, moving slower than usual. His boots dragged slightly in the dirt. "You ride?" Miller asked without preamble. Daniel looked up, nodded once. Miller tossed an old rifle toward him, not roughly, but with a heavy sort of intent. "Good. Might need someone who can. Got wolves near the northern ridge." Daniel caught the rifle without thinking. It was heavier than it looked, the wood worn smooth by years of hands gripping it tight. He didn't ask what Miller really meant. Around these parts, wolves didn't always mean four-legged ones. The next morning, Daniel saddled Rosa before the sun crested the hills. The air was sharp, the kind that cut into your lungs and made you feel alive in a way no amount of whiskey ever could. He packed light, a canteen, jerky, the rifle, and headed north. The ride was long and slow. The land grew wilder the further he went. Sagebrush clawed at Rosa's legs. Hawks circled overhead, crying out against the endless sky. There were no real paths here, just faint traces where the earth had been worn down by animals and the stubborn footsteps of men who came before. Near the ridge, he dismounted, leading Rosa by the reins. The ground was broken, uneven. He spotted tracks in the dirt, too large for coyotes, too many for a single wolf. His jaw tightened. He crouched, touching the edge of a track. Still fresh, maybe an hour old. Daniel straightened up, scanning the horizon. Nothing but low hills and the shimmer of heat rising off stone. Rosa shifted beside him, her muscles bunching. Her ears flicked forward sharply. Daniel raised the rifle slowly. He didn't see anything at first. Just the silence, thick and pressing, like the earth itself was holding its breath. Then movement, quick, low to the ground, weaving through the sage. It wasn't wolves. 3 men appeared, rough and dirty, their clothes patched with scraps of whatever they could find. Bandits. Scavengers. The kind of men who saw abandoned farms and lonely riders as opportunities. One of them shouted something, voice lost on the wind. Daniel didn't wait. He fired once into the air, the crack of the rifle splitting the silence like a whip. Rosa snorted and pulled back, but he held her firm. The men stopped, sizing him up. One of them, the tallest, spat in the dirt and raised a hand, not in peace, but a warning. Daniel lowered the rifle just a fraction, enough to show he wasn't bluffing, but not enough to invite a fight. The standoff lasted only a minute, maybe less. Then the men turned, disappearing back into the broken hills like rats. Daniel let out a slow breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He patted Rosa's neck, feeling her trembling under his hand. "Good girl," he murmured. He stayed there a while longer, watching the ridges, making sure they were really gone. Then he mounted up and turned back toward the farm. By the time he returned, the sun was sinking low, painting the land in bruised purples and gold. Miller stood on the porch, arms crossed, watching him. Daniel said nothing, just handed the rifle back. But first, Miller took it, gave a grunt that might have been approval. "Looks like you earned your keep," he said. Daniel nodded once, then turned toward the barn, Rosa following close behind. That night, Daniel sat by the fire behind the stable, eating bread that tasted of dust and drinking water gone warm in its canteen. Above him, stars bloomed like flowers across the dark. He didn't think about the men he might have to face again. He thought about Rosa, about the trust in her step, the weight of her breathing beside him. Sometimes survival wasn't about winning. Sometimes it was about holding a piece of the world together, just long enough to believe it still mattered. The following days slipped past like dust through calloused fingers. Daniel kept to his work, fixing gates, moving hay, tending to the horses. Rosa followed him like a shadow now, never more than a few steps behind. It was a small thing, but it settled something restless inside him. Miller spoke little, as always, but there was a change in the air around the ranch. A stiffness, like the land itself was bracing for something. One evening, after the work was done and the sky was streaked with blood-orange light, Miller approached while Daniel sat by the barn, whittling a piece of scrap wood into the shape of a bird. "You seen anything?" Miller asked, voice low. Daniel shook his head slowly. "Not since the ridge." Miller stared off toward the north, toward the hills where the bandits had appeared, and then vanished like smoke. "They're not gone," Miller said, almost to himself. "They're waiting. Watching that." Daniel set down the half-formed bird. "You expect them to come here?" Miller's jaw tightened. "I expect nothing good comes easy out here." There wasn't much to say to that. Daniel knew too well that in places like this, trouble didn't announce itself with flags and drums. It crept in like a slow sickness, unnoticed until it was too late. Later that night, as he lay on the thin cot in the bunkhouse, Daniel listened to the wind batter the windows. He heard the horses shifting uneasily in their stalls. Rosa's soft huffing breath came from just outside, where she insisted on bedding down near his door. He thought about the bandits, about the glint of desperate eyes, the way their hands twitched toward their belts. Men like that didn't just walk away, not unless they had a reason to wait. The next morning, Miller handed him a battered shotgun along with the usual tools. "Keep it close," he said simply. Daniel strapped it to his saddle without a word. Around noon, the sheriff rode up, his horse lathered with sweat. He was a small, wiry man with sharp eyes and a nervous energy that set Daniel's teeth on edge. He spoke quickly with Miller, while Daniel watched from a distance. He couldn't catch every word, but a few slipped through. "Farmhouses hit south of the creek. No survivors. 2 nights ago." When the sheriff rode off again, kicking up a trail of dust behind him, Miller walked over, his face grim. "We double the night watch," Miller said. "Starting now." Daniel nodded. There was no need for more. That night, Daniel took first watch. He sat near the barn with the shotgun laid across his knees, Rosa tethered loosely nearby. The stars were sharp and cold overhead. Coyotes yipped somewhere far off, but the sound didn't ease the tension in his gut. Hours crawled by. Nothing but the usual sighs and creaks of a living farm. But just past midnight, Daniel caught something different. A flicker of movement along the fence line. Too low and deliberate for an animal. He rose silently, hand tightening on the shotgun. Rosa stirred, ears pinned back. Daniel moved toward the sound, boots silent on the hard-packed earth. His heart beat slow and steady, the way it had when he tracked wounded men through worse places than this. A figure crouched near the far gate, working at the latch with clumsy, urgent hands. Daniel raised the shotgun. "Don't." The figure froze. Slowly, a boy no older than 15 straightened up, hands spread wide. His clothes were ragged, his face pinched with fear and hunger. "I wasn't gonna hurt nobody," the boy said quickly. "I swear it. Just needed food." Daniel kept the shotgun level, but lowered it slightly. "You alone?" he asked. The boy shook his head, and something in his eyes gave him away. "How many?" Daniel demanded. The boy hesitated, then muttered, 5, maybe 6 more. Daniel's stomach turned cold. That meant they were here, now, and likely surrounding the property. "Get to the house," Daniel said, pushing the boy ahead of him with the barrel of the shotgun. He whistled once, sharp and low. Rosa tensed, but didn't bolt. She had learned his signals. Miller met them at the porch, a pistol already in his hand. Daniel shoved the boy forward. "Scouts," Daniel said simply. Miller cursed under his breath. "They're not just passing through." From the shadows beyond the barn, shapes began to form, slow, careful movements against the silvered grass. Bandits. More than just the desperate few Daniel had seen before. Organized. Patient. "They're coming for the stock," Miller said, voice flat. Daniel nodded. Horses meant money. Horses meant survival. Out here, stealing a man's stock was the same as killing him slowly. The men inside the house were already stirring, pulling weapons from under beds, lighting lanterns. The ranch hands, mostly young and half-trained, but they would fight if they had to. There was nowhere else to run. Daniel checked the shotgun again, feeling its weight, the way it settled into his grip like an old friend. Rosa stood behind him, solid and unafraid. The boy, the one who had tried to slip the gate, crouched by the porch, wide-eyed and shaking. Daniel met Miller's gaze once across the short distance between them. No words were needed. The land had taught them both the same truth. Sometimes, the only way to hold onto a piece of the world was to fight for it. And sometimes, even that wasn't enough. The first shot cracked through the night, like a whip. For a moment, time itself seemed to hold its breath. Then the world erupted. Daniel dropped low behind the water trough as a bullet splintered the edge of the porch above him. Rosa, trained and fearless, stayed tight by his side. From the barn, two of the ranch hands fired into the dark, their shots wild and panicked. Miller's voice cut through the chaos, steady and sharp. "Hold your ground. Don't waste your shots." Daniel moved fast, heart thudding against his ribs, shotgun braced against his shoulder. He scanned the open yard. The bandits were using the fences and sheds for cover, trying to close in. Their movements were quick, practiced. This wasn't desperation anymore. This was a raid. He caught sight of one bandit darting toward the corral and fired. The man cried out and crumpled in the dirt. No time to check if it was fatal. The boy, the one they'd caught, still cowered by the porch steps, arms wrapped around his head. Daniel felt a flash of pity and anger. The kid was just a pawn. Someone had sent him forward, knowing he might get caught or killed. Bullets thudded into the thick wooden posts around the house. Glass shattered somewhere behind Daniel, probably a window. Someone cursed inside. Miller moved like a man who had done this before. He and one of the older ranch hands, Tate, picked off shapes in the dark with grim precision. But for every attacker they dropped, it seemed two more pressed forward. Daniel realized it wasn't just about stealing the horses anymore. These men wanted to break the ranch, leave nothing behind. The thought tightened something deep in his chest. Another figure lunged from the side, aiming for the barn door. Daniel fired, the blast lighting up the night. For a split second, the man tumbled backward, vanishing into the tall grass. Rosa barked once, a sharp warning, and Daniel turned to see a bandit climbing the fence near the smaller paddock. He cursed under his breath, grabbed a handful of loose rocks, and hurled them. The distraction worked long enough for Tate to draw a bead and shoot. The attack felt endless. Gunpowder stung the air. Dust rose in choking clouds. Men shouted. Horses screamed. But little by little, the defenders held. The bandits began to falter. They weren't ready for a full fight. They hoped for fear, for quick surrender. Instead, they'd found stubborn men and tougher ground. One final push, a desperate surge toward the barn, and Daniel felt the tide shift. He dropped another man, with a shot to the shoulder. Miller picked off two more as they tried to scramble over the broken fence. And then silence. No more figures moving through the darkness. No more shouting. Just the ragged breathing of tired men and the soft, terrible sounds of wounded horses. Daniel stood slowly, his knees stiff. His hands trembled from exhaustion, not fear. Miller walked the perimeter with Tate, guns still ready. They counted bodies without ceremony. 6 attackers dead. 2 wounded so badly they wouldn't walk again. The rest had fled into the hills, carrying whatever shame or hatred had driven them here. The boy was still by the porch, staring at Daniel like he was some kind of ghost. Daniel knelt in front of him. "You hungry?" he asked. The boy nodded, almost too weak to speak. "Good," Daniel said. "Then you can eat. After you work." He stood and offered the boy a hand. The kid hesitated, then took it. The next morning, under a thin, colorless sky, they buried the dead at the edge of the property. It was rough work. No prayers, no crosses, just a line of stones and the silent agreement that some men chose their fate, and some men simply ran out of time. The sheriff showed up again around noon, a posse trailing behind him. Too late, as always. He looked at the battered fence, the bullet-scarred barn, the exhausted faces of the ranchers. "You'll need to make a statement," he said to Miller. Miller just grunted. "Ain't nothing to say." The sheriff fidgeted, wanting to ask more, but thinking better of it. He left soon after, promising to keep an eye out for any other trouble. Daniel watched him go, feeling a hollow sort of satisfaction. Men like that couldn't understand what it meant to bleed for a piece of land, to fight for something that wouldn't fight back. He turned to look at Rosa, who stood calmly by the corral, one ear flicking lazily. He turned to the boy, who was now carrying buckets of water to the wounded horses under Tate's sharp eye. He turned to Miller, who leaned against the porch post, smoking a hand-rolled cigarette, already thinking about rebuilding. This was the cost. This was the way of things. Dust, blood, and broken fences. And yet somehow, the ranch still stood. Daniel picked up a hammer and walked toward the barn. There was work to do. Always more work. The days that followed blurred together in a steady rhythm of work and weariness. Mornings began before the sun crested the hills, with the chill of dew still clinging to the grass. Evenings ended under skies heavy with stars, bodies sore and spirits thin, but still standing. The ranch bore its wounds like an old soldier, broken fence posts, bloodstains in the dirt, bullet scars on the barn doors. Yet life pushed forward because it had to. Miller directed the rebuilding with few words, mostly nods and pointed looks. Tate led the younger hands, teaching them with short, sharp commands how to patch wood, reinforce gates, and care for the horses that had been spooked half to death. Daniel kept close to Rosa. She had taken a shallow cut along her flank during the fight, not enough to cripple her, but enough to slow her. He treated the wound twice a day with salve, speaking low and steady to her as he worked. "You're tougher than all of us," he said once, running his hand gently along her neck. Rosa simply blinked at him, patient and calm. The boy, whose name turned out to be Caleb, earned his place without complaint. Daniel had expected some resistance, a runaway's pride or the stubbornness of youth, but Caleb worked hard, harder, even, than some of the grown men. He shoveled stalls, mended harnesses, fetched water. He never asked for rest, never asked questions. It was the kind of silence Daniel understood well. Late one afternoon, after hours of hauling lumber and fixing fences, Daniel found Caleb sitting by the edge of the pasture, staring at Rosa as she grazed. "You ever ridden before?" Daniel asked, lowering himself to sit nearby. Caleb shrugged. "Once. A mule back home." Daniel smiled faintly. "Mule's good enough." He stood and offered a hand. "Come on, then." At first, Rosa was wary of the boy. She shifted, ears back, as Caleb approached. Daniel guided him, patient. "Slow. Talk to her. Let her smell you." Caleb whispered something, words Daniel didn't catch, and held his hand steady. Rosa's nostrils flared. Then she lowered her head, touching his palm lightly. Daniel nodded. "Now up." It took 3 tries, a lot of awkward fumbling, and more than a few curses under breath, but eventually Caleb swung onto Rosa's back. He sat stiff and terrified, clinging to the saddle horn like it might save his life. Daniel laughed, a rare sound these days, and clapped him on the leg. "Loosen up, or she's gonna think you're made of iron." Bit by bit, Caleb relaxed. Rosa, gentle as always, walked slow circles around the yard, patient with his clumsy cues. Watching them, something settled in Daniel's chest. He didn't know what it was exactly. Hope, maybe. Or something quieter. Something deeper. Work wore on. The repairs to the ranch went slowly but surely. Supplies had to be fetched from the nearest town. 2 days' ride there and back, over rough trails and through places where law was more rumor than fact. Miller sent Daniel and Tate to make the trip. Before they left, Miller pulled Daniel aside. "Watch the hills," he said simply. Daniel just nodded. He already planned to. The ride to town was uneventful. Dry winds kicked dust up into their faces, and buzzards circled lazy above the scrub. They slept rough by the roadside, rifles across their knees. In town, news traveled faster than water in a cracked bucket. The fight at Miller's ranch was already the talk of the saloon. Some said it was a massacre. Others said the ranchers had it coming, that they'd stolen land that wasn't rightly theirs in the first place. Daniel ignored the talk. He wasn't there for whiskey or words. Supplies were bought: nails, flour, feed, lamp oil. Heavy bundles loaded onto a battered wagon. On the ride back, they stayed sharper. Daniel's eyes constantly scanned the ridgelines, watching for glints of metal or unnatural movement. Tate did the same without being told. But the hills stayed empty. They returned to the ranch battered but whole. Miller gave them a rare nod of approval. "You made good time." Daniel unloaded the wagon, muscles screaming, while Caleb rushed to help. The boy had gotten stronger in just a few weeks. His arms didn't look like twigs anymore, and there was a steadiness to him that hadn't been there before. Later, while the others finished up, Daniel walked Rosa down to the stream to drink. The evening light turned the water to molten gold. Rosa bent her head, sipping noisily. Daniel sat back against a sun-warmed rock, letting the quiet fill him. For the first time in a long time, he let his guard down just a little. He didn't know what winter would bring. He didn't know if the men who had fled would come back someday, with more guns and more anger. But for now, here by the water, with the horse he trusted and the land holding him firm, he believed, just for a moment, that they could make it through. The first frost came early that year. One morning, Daniel stepped out onto the porch and saw the ground glittering under a thin sheet of ice. Rosa's breath rose in soft white clouds as she stood by the corral. Over the hills, the sky was sharp and empty, the color of bruised iron. Winter had always been a hard teacher out here, but this time it felt heavier, like something was waiting beyond the cold. Miller called a meeting that evening. They gathered in the main barn, the horses shifting nervously in their stalls as the wind howled outside. "We need to be ready," Miller said, voice rough from the cold. "Wood's gotta be stacked high. Water's gonna freeze. Animals need extra feed. If we ain't prepared by the first real storm, we won't last." No one argued. They all knew it already. Surviving wasn't about living well. It was about not dying. Daniel was put in charge of the horses. Tate took the cattle. Caleb was assigned to the woodpile, cutting and stacking alongside the other hands. The days grew shorter, sharper. Sunset seemed to come in the middle of the afternoon. Every morning was a battle against frozen gates, iced-up troughs, and numbed fingers. Daniel worked without complaint, but he could feel the strain pulling at everyone, fraying tempers, quiet resentments. Even Rosa seemed restless, pawing the frozen ground, eyes bright with nervous energy. One night, as the wind screamed against the shutters, Daniel sat by the dying fire, sharpening a knife by lamplight. Across the room, Caleb lay on a pile of blankets, too tired to even eat. His hands were blistered and raw from chopping wood all day. "You'll toughen up," Daniel said, not unkindly. The boy didn't answer, but Daniel saw the slight nod. That was enough. December came down hard. The first real storm hit without much warning. Clouds swallowed the horizon in the span of an hour. By nightfall, snow piled against the doors, and the world outside turned to a blank, frozen wasteland. Daniel barely slept. Every few hours, he and Tate checked the barns, breaking ice off the water barrels, bringing in animals that might not survive the night. Rosa handled it better than most. She stood calm and still, steam rising from her back. Daniel rubbed her down with old burlap sacks, murmuring nonsense words under his breath, just to hear something human in all that endless white silence. Caleb stayed busy, running between buildings with arms full of wood and supplies. His face was red and raw from the wind, but there was a stubborn light in his eyes that hadn't been there when he first arrived. Late one evening, after hauling heavy bundles to the kitchen, Caleb hesitated by the door where Daniel was sitting. "You think it'll always be this hard?" he asked, voice small. Daniel looked up from sharpening a hatchet. "Maybe," he said. "Maybe harder." The boy frowned. "But it gets easier," Daniel added after a pause. "You get stronger. You stop looking for it to be easy." Caleb seemed to turn that over in his head for a long time. Then he nodded and went back to work without another word. Daniel watched him go, a slow grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. Days passed in a strange, muted rhythm. Chores, meals, sleep, hauling wood, tending horses, fighting the cold. At night, they huddled around the fire, telling stories more out of duty than pleasure. Stories about old ranches, old wars, old loves. Half the tales were lies, and everyone knew it, but no one cared. It wasn't the truth that mattered. It was the telling. Rosa grew restless as the storms wore on. She needed to run, to stretch her legs, but the ice made it too dangerous. Daniel promised her, quietly, when no one was around to hear, that come spring, he'd ride her hard across the open fields until her heart burst with joy. If spring ever came, the weight of the season pressed down on them all. Even Miller, tough as he was, moved slower, spoke less. One morning, after a long, brutal night of wind and cold, they found one of the old mares dead in her stall, just frozen, as if she had laid down and decided not to get up again. Miller didn't say a word. He and Daniel dragged the body out behind the barn and covered it with snow. Later that evening, Daniel found Caleb sitting by the fence, staring out into the white void. "You all right?" Daniel asked. Caleb shrugged, then said, "I ain't ever seen something just give up before." Daniel sat down next to him, boots crunching on the frozen ground. "It's a hard world," he said, "harder than most folks like to believe." He looked out at the endless white, thinking about all the things he'd seen in his life. Things that broke men. Things that bent them until they didn't stand up again. "But sometimes," Daniel said, "you get lucky. You find something worth standing for." He glanced at Caleb. Or someone. The boy didn't say anything, but after a moment, he leaned his shoulder lightly against Daniel's side. They sat there until the cold drove them back inside. Winter stretched on longer than anyone had hoped. By mid-February, the snow drifts along the fence lines reached up to the rails. The horses grew leaner despite their rations. Men moved slower, their boots worn slick, their coats ragged. Yet something in the cold began to break. Not the snow. That still came, light and steady. But inside the ranch, among the men and the animals, a kind of stubborn life stirred. It showed in small ways. In the way Caleb laughed when Rosa nudged his shoulder for a scrap of bread. In the way Tate sang old songs, rough and tuneless, while hauling water barrels. Even in the way Miller, stone-faced as ever, paused to share his pipe with Daniel by the fire, without a word. The worst had passed. Not by much, but enough. One morning, Daniel woke to the sound of water dripping from the eaves. He stepped outside and stood still, blinking in the pale gray light. The snow was melting. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, but melting nonetheless. The trees along the edge of the pasture shivered, their black branches wet and gleaming. Patches of brown earth showed through the white. Rosa, restless for days, kicked up her heels and trotted a clumsy, half-frozen lap around the corral. Caleb whooped and clapped, startling the horses and drawing grumbles from the bunkhouse. Daniel just smiled, watching the breath of life return to the land. There was still work to be done. Always work. Fences needed mending. Bad sections of roof needed patching. Dead trees had to be cleared before they rotted where they stood. But there was a lightness to the work now, the kind that comes when a man knows he has survived something that meant to end him. Late in the day, Daniel rode out with Caleb to check the upper pastures. The fields there had been left fallow last year, full of stones and thistles, but they would need them soon enough if they planned to expand. Rosa moved carefully under Daniel, ears flicking at every rustle in the wet grass. Caleb rode a smaller, stubborn gelding named Duke, who tested him at every step. They crested a rise and paused, looking out over the valley below. The river had started to thaw, cutting silver threads through the land. Birds circled high above, and somewhere out of sight, a coyote yipped. For a long time, neither spoke. Then Caleb said, "We could run cattle here." Daniel nodded. "Maybe even plant some oats, if we clear it." The boy turned to him, eyes bright. "You think we'll stay?" Daniel considered the question. There had been times, cold nights, hungers that gnawed worse than wolves, when he thought about leaving, about letting the land bury itself and moving west, where men said the weather was kinder and the ground richer. But standing there, with Rosa under him and Caleb by his side, the answer felt simple. "We'll stay," he said, not because it was easy, but because it was theirs. When they returned to the ranch, evening was falling. A light mist crept in from the river, and the smell of thawed earth filled the air. Inside the barn, Miller was waiting. He leaned against a beam, pipe in one hand, watching them unsaddle. "How's it look?" he asked. Daniel shrugged. "Rough, but usable." Miller grunted. "Everything's rough out here." He let out a long, slow breath. "Come spring," he said, "I'm stepping back." Daniel froze, one hand still on Rosa's bridle. "What do you mean?" Miller tapped ash from his pipe. "Means I'm getting old. Means I want a man I trust running this place when I can't anymore." Daniel stared at him. "It wasn't a thing you said lightly out here. Land wasn't just dirt. It was blood and bone and memory. Passing it on was like passing on a piece of your soul." "You sure?" Daniel asked. Miller nodded. "You Tate the boy. You keep it alive. You teach it to breathe again." Daniel swallowed hard. He thought about the long rides, the broken gates, the cold nights with frozen blood on the ground. He thought about Rosa's steady weight beneath him. He thought about Caleb's stubborn grin. He thought about home. "I'll do it," Daniel said. Miller clapped him once, hard on the shoulder. "Good." Nothing more needed saying. That night, as the wind softened and the stars came out, Daniel sat outside the bunkhouse with Rosa tethered nearby and Caleb sitting cross-legged in the dirt. They passed a battered canteen back and forth, filled with something sharp and warming that Tate had brewed up. Caleb asked, after a while, "You ever think about leaving?" Daniel looked up at the wide, black sky. "Used to," he said. "A lot." "And now?" Daniel smiled, slow and tired and sure. "Now I think about staying." Caleb nodded, as if that made perfect sense. They sat in silence after that, listening to the land breathe around them, the first true breath of a world waking up after too long frozen. Winter stretched on longer than anyone had hoped. By mid-February, the snow drifts along the fence lines reached up to the rails. The horses grew leaner despite their rations. Men moved slower, their boots worn slick, their coats ragged. Yet something in the cold began to break. Not the snow. That still came, light and steady. But inside the ranch, among the men and the animals, a kind of stubborn life stirred. It showed in small ways. In the way Caleb laughed when Rosa nudged his shoulder for a scrap of bread. In the way Tate sang old songs, rough and tuneless, while hauling water barrels. Even in the way Miller, stone-faced as ever, paused to share his pipe with Daniel by the fire, without a word. The worst had passed. Not by much, but enough. One morning, Daniel woke to the sound of water dripping from the eaves. He stepped outside and stood still, blinking in the pale gray light. The snow was melting. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, but melting nonetheless. The trees along the edge of the pasture shivered, their black branches wet and gleaming. Patches of brown earth showed through the white. Rosa, restless for days, kicked up her heels and trotted a clumsy, half-frozen lap around the corral. Caleb whooped and clapped, startling the horses and drawing grumbles from the bunkhouse. Daniel just smiled, watching the breath of life return to the land. There was still work to be done. Always work. Fences needed mending. Bad sections of roof needed patching. Dead trees had to be cleared before they rotted where they stood. But there was a lightness to the work now. The kind that comes when a man knows he has survived something that meant to end him. Late in the day, Daniel rode out with Caleb to check the upper pastures. The fields there had been left fallow last year, full of stones and thistles, but they would need them soon enough if they planned to expand. Rosa moved carefully under Daniel, ears flicking at every rustle in the wet grass. Caleb rode a smaller, stubborn gelding named Duke, who tested him at every step. They crested a rise and paused, looking out over the valley below. The river had started to thaw, cutting silver threads through the land. Birds circled high above, and somewhere out of sight, a coyote yipped. For a long time, neither spoke. Then Caleb said, "We could run cattle here." Daniel nodded. "Maybe even plant some oats, if we clear it." The boy turned to him, eyes bright. "You think we'll stay?" Daniel considered the question. There had been times, cold nights, hungers that gnawed worse than wolves, when he thought about leaving, about letting the land bury itself and moving west, where men said the weather was kinder and the ground richer. But standing there, with Rosa under him and Caleb by his side, the answer felt simple. "We'll stay," he said, not because it was easy, but because it was theirs. When they returned to the ranch, evening was falling. A light mist crept in from the river, and the smell of thawed earth filled the air. Inside the barn, Miller was waiting. He leaned against a beam, pipe in one hand, watching them unsaddle. "How's it look?" he asked. Daniel shrugged. "Rough, but usable." Miller grunted. "Everything's rough out here." He let out a long, slow breath. "Come spring," he said, "I'm stepping back." Daniel froze, one hand still on Rosa's bridle. "What do you mean?" Miller tapped ash from his pipe. "Means I'm getting old. Means I want a man I trust running this place when I can't anymore." Daniel stared at him. "It wasn't a thing you said lightly out here. Land wasn't just dirt. It was blood and bone and memory. Passing it on was like passing on a piece of your soul." "You sure?" Daniel asked. Miller nodded. "You Tate the boy. You keep it alive. You teach it to breathe again." Daniel swallowed hard. He thought about the long rides, the broken gates, the cold nights with frozen blood on the ground. He thought about Rosa's steady weight beneath him. He thought about Caleb's stubborn grin. He thought about home. "I'll do it," Daniel said. Miller clapped him once, hard on the shoulder. "Good." Nothing more needed saying. That night, as the wind softened and the stars came out, Daniel sat outside the bunkhouse with Rosa tethered nearby, and Caleb, sitting cross-legged in the dirt. They passed a battered canteen back and forth, filled with something sharp and warming that Tate had brewed up. Caleb asked, after a while, "You ever think about leaving?" Daniel looked up at the wide, black sky. "Used to," he said. "A lot." "And now?" Daniel smiled, slow and tired and sure. "Now I think about staying." Caleb nodded, as if that made perfect sense. They sat in silence after that, listening to the land breathe around them, the first true breath of a world waking up after too long frozen.